God, let me die before he returns.
These were the final words, scratched into a dungeon wall beneath the royal palace of Madrid. Written by a liberal politician's daughter in 1822. She was just 17 years old. Her crime? Her father had dared to speak of constitutional monarchy. Her punishment? 3 months as the personal plaything of King Ferdinand VII, a monarch so twisted that his own courtiers called him the Beast of Madrid. What happened to her in those palace chambers was just one drop in an ocean of depravity that would define the most sexually perverted reign in European history. This is the story of Ferdinand VII of Spain, the king who turned an entire nation into his personal brothel of suffering. But how does a prince become such a monster? How does royal blood turn so poisonous that it corrupts everything it touches? To understand the depths of Ferdinand's depravity, we must journey back to where it all began, with an act of betrayal so twisted that it would make Judas himself seem honorable by comparison. The making of a monster. Ferdinand's descent into evil began not with the coronation, but with patricide, not literal, but something far more psychologically devastating. In 1808, when 18-year-old Prince Ferdinand committed an act so heinous against his own father that it would set the tone for decades of horror to come. He orchestrated the public humiliation and abdication of his own father, King Charles IV, in what became known as the Tumult of Aranjuez. Picture this scene: a cold March night in the royal residence of Aranjuez. The prince, with cold calculation, had orchestrated riots against his father's government. But this wasn't political reform. This was personal vengeance wrapped in the guise of patriotism. Ferdinand had discovered the scandalous affair between his stepmother, Queen Maria Luisa, and the Prime Minister Manuel Godoy. But instead of handling this family shame privately, he manipulated the Spanish people's outrage against Godoy to orchestrate his father's downfall. The young prince watched from his window as mobs stormed through the palace grounds, calling for his father's head. Charles IV, terrified and broken, had no choice but to abdicate in favor of his son. But Ferdinand's victory was poisoned from the start. He had tasted the intoxicating power of manipulation and betrayal, and like a drug, he would never have enough. Within weeks, the new King Ferdinand VII found himself face to face with Napoleon Bonaparte. Here, the true depths of his character were revealed. Rather than fight for Spanish independence, Ferdinand groveled before the French emperor, literally prostrating himself and begging to be allowed to marry into Napoleon's family. Napoleon, disgusted by this display of cowardice, wrote, "He is a man who could betray anyone for a crust of bread." For 6 years, while Spanish patriots died fighting French occupation, Ferdinand lived in luxurious exile at the Château de Valencey, dining with his captors while his people bled in the streets of Madrid and Zaragoza. He wasn't a prisoner, he was a willing collaborator, hoping to return to Spain as Napoleon's puppet king. The perfect betrayal. What happened next was so calculated, so perfectly evil, that historians still struggle to comprehend how one man could orchestrate such complete devastation of human hope. In 1814, Ferdinand VII returned to Spain, and the liberals who had fought for constitutional monarchy made the fatal mistake of believing their king had learned the value of freedom during his exile. Spanish liberals, many bearing scars from fighting Napoleon's armies, lined the streets of Madrid to welcome home their king. They had prepared a constitutional monarchy based on the Constitution of 1812, believing Ferdinand would embrace the democratic reforms that had emerged during his absence. They were about to discover that 6 years in exile had only sharpened Ferdinand's appetite for absolute power and revenge. Instead of embracing freedom, Ferdinand staged what historians call the perfect betrayal. On May 4, 1814, he issued a decree that didn't just reject the Constitution, it declared every liberal reform an act of treason. The document proclaimed that anyone who had supported constitutional government during his absence was guilty of rebellion against the crown. What followed was a bloodbath disguised as justice. Ferdinand's secret police, the Royalist volunteers, became his personal army of terror. They swept through Spain, arresting anyone who had dared to speak of freedom. Former war heroes, priests who had preached liberty, journalists, teachers, all disappeared into Ferdinand's dungeons. The king didn't just want to rule, he wanted to break the very spirit of Spanish resistance. In the prisons of Madrid, Valencia, and Sevilla, liberal prisoners were subjected to psychological torture. They were shown fake execution orders, told their families had been arrested, forced to watch mock executions of their cellmates. Ferdinand had discovered that breaking a man's mind was more satisfying than simply breaking his body. The Palace of Horrors. Behind the palace doors, Ferdinand created something so perverse that foreign diplomats struggled to describe the horrors they witnessed. The royal palace of Madrid became a labyrinth of secret passages and hidden chambers where the line between pleasure and torture became indistinguishable. Ferdinand's court was notorious throughout Europe for its excesses. Foreign enemies wrote in coded letters about witnessing scenes that violated every principle of Christian kingship. The British ambassador noted that Ferdinand seemed to derive pleasure from exercising absolute power over his subjects, particularly in matters of life and death. Most disturbing were Ferdinand's relationships with his courtiers' wives and daughters. The king established a system where noble families were required to present their unmarried daughters at court for his inspection. These private audiences, conducted behind locked doors, became legendary throughout Spanish high society. Families who refused to participate found themselves suddenly investigated for treason. Ferdinand had weaponized sexuality itself, using it as both reward and punishment, creating an atmosphere where survival depended on complicity with his twisted appetites. The palace became a place where virtue was dangerous and corruption was the price of safety. The Inquisition Reborn. In 1814, Ferdinand made a decision so monstrous that it transformed a religious institution into his personal playground of sadism. And what he did there was worse than anything the medieval Inquisition had ever imagined. Ferdinand VII restored the Spanish Inquisition, but not as a religious institution. Under Ferdinand, the Inquisition became his personal torture network, designed to satisfy his deepest psychological needs for control and cruelty. The chambers were equipped with devices that medieval inquisitors never imagined, and Ferdinand personally approved the design of new torture methods, combining traditional techniques with psychological manipulation. But the king's fascination with the Inquisition went beyond political repression. He would often visit the torture chambers personally, not to question prisoners, but to observe their breaking points. Witnesses described how Ferdinand would sit in a special throne-like chair, taking notes on the prisoners' reactions, studying their faces as they begged for mercy. One particularly horrific account comes from a French diplomat who was secretly allowed to witness one of these sessions. He described Ferdinand's face as showing an unnatural ecstasy during the torture, and noted that the king seemed to become aroused by the prisoners' suffering. The diplomat's report, hidden in French archives for over 2 centuries, described Ferdinand as exhibiting behavior that surpassed even the worst Roman emperors in its perverse cruelty. Prisoners were forced to watch their family members tortured, not for information but for Ferdinand's entertainment. The Inquisition under Ferdinand processed over 20,000 cases, but fewer than a dozen were actually related to religious heresy. The rest were liberals, intellectuals, or anyone who had shown insufficient enthusiasm for absolute monarchy. Ferdinand had turned religious persecution into a system for satisfying his pathological need to dominate and destroy human dignity. The constitutional nightmare. When liberal officers forced Ferdinand to accept constitutional limits in 1820, they thought they had caged the monster. Instead, they had only redirected his hunger toward prey that would leave their own families destroyed. Unable to express his rage through official executions, Ferdinand turned his court into a hunting ground for a different kind of prey. During the 3 years of constitutional government, 1821 to 1823, Ferdinand was forbidden from executing political prisoners, but he found other ways to satisfy his appetite for control. Palace servants from this period left testimonies describing how the king would summon the wives and daughters of liberal politicians to private consultations about their husbands' and fathers' political activities. These sessions, conducted in Ferdinand's private study behind locked doors, became legendary among Madrid's political class. Women who refused these summons found their male relatives suddenly facing trumped-up charges of treason. Those who complied returned home changed, many never speaking of what had occurred, others suffering what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. This was where that 17-year-old girl, the politician's daughter, whose desperate plea opened our story, spent those 3 months of hell. Ferdinand had discovered that sexual domination could be more devastating than political execution. He wasn't just destroying his enemies' bodies, he was destroying their families, their honor, their very identity as men who could protect their loved one. The British consul's wife wrote in her private diary about attending a royal reception where she witnessed Ferdinand's behavior toward the Spanish noblewomen. She described how the king would publicly humiliate married women by making sexual references to their private audiences with him, watching their husbands' faces crumble with the knowledge of what their compliance with tyranny had cost them. The legacy of evil. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, but the poison he had injected into Spanish society would fester for generations. He had transformed the Spanish monarchy from an institution of governance into an instrument of psychological warfare, where power wasn't just exercised, it was perverted into something that corrupted everyone it touched. The king who claimed to defend Catholic values had made himself the antithesis of every Christian principle. He had turned loyalty into complicity, justice into revenge, and authority into sadism. Ferdinand VII didn't just rule Spain, he violated it, leaving scars that would influence Spanish politics well into the 20th century. Perhaps most chilling is how Ferdinand's reign reveals the ultimate destination of unchecked power, not just political tyranny, but the complete perversion of human relationships themselves. He had discovered that the most effective way to control people wasn't through fear of death, but through the destruction of their capacity for dignity, love, and trust. Ferdinand VII wasn't just the most perverted king in history because of what he did to his enemies. He was the most perverted because of what he did to the very concept of kingship itself. He took an institution meant to serve God and country and twisted it into a reflection of his own diseased soul.